Wyoming Territory, 1873. The vast prairie stretched beneath a storm-brewing sky as Caleb Hawkins squinted against the late afternoon sun. From the porch of his modest ranch house, he watched distant thunderheads gathering over the mountains to the west. At 25, most would say he'd already claimed more than his fair share of success: 200 acres, a sturdy home built by his own hands, and a small but growing herd of cattle. Yet the achievement felt hollow without someone to share it. "No use thinking on it," he muttered to himself, adjusting his well-worn Stetson. "The frontier is no place for tender feelings." Caleb had watched too many women wither under the harsh Wyoming sun. His own mother had survived barely 3 winters before a fever took her, leaving his father a shell of a man who drank himself to death by the time Caleb turned 16. Love was a luxury few could afford in this unforgiving land. Better to focus on what could be controlled: cattle, land, and survival. The approaching storm mirrored his darkening mood. 3 weeks ago, in a moment of weakness, he'd posted an advertisement in an Eastern newspaper for a mail-order bride. The decision had gnawed at him ever since. What kind of woman would agree to marry a stranger in this desolate country, and what kind of man was he to ask it of her? Thunder rumbled in the distance as Josiah Miller, Caleb's ranch hand and only friend, rode up the dirt path toward the house. "Mail's in," Josiah called, waving an envelope, "and it looks like you got yourself an answer to that bride advertisement." Caleb's stomach tightened. He took the letter with reluctant hands, noting the delicate script addressing Mr. Caleb Hawkins, Whispering Pine Ranch, Wyoming Territory. "You gonna open it?" Josiah asked, dismounting. "Later." Caleb tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Storm's coming. Best get the horses in." That night by lamplight, Caleb finally broke the seal. The paper was fine, the handwriting educated but not pretentious. "Dear Mr. Hawkins, I am responding to your advertisement for a bride. My name is Grace Collins, aged 22. I was raised in Boston but find myself seeking new beginnings. I have some education, can keep accounts, and am not afraid of hard work. I believe I would make a suitable wife for a rancher, though I must be honest that I have no experience with rural life. If you find me acceptable, I can arrange passage within the month. I ask only for honest treatment and the chance to build a good life together. Respectfully, Grace Collins." Enclosed was a small photograph showing a young woman with serious eyes and light hair pulled back neatly. Not beautiful in the showy way of saloon girls, but there was something in her expression, determination perhaps, that caught his attention. Caleb set the letter down, conflicted. He needed a practical arrangement, someone to cook, keep house, maybe bear children someday. Not romance, not love. Those luxuries belonged to different men in different places. After a sleepless night, he wrote back accepting her proposal and enclosed money for her journey. 8 weeks later, on a sweltering August day, Caleb stood awkwardly on the railway platform in Laramie. The train whistle pierced the air as the locomotive chugged into the station, belching black smoke. Passengers began to disembark, and Caleb adjusted his clean shirt for the 5th time, uncomfortable in his Sunday best. "Mr. Hawkins." He turned to find a young woman regarding him with clear blue eyes. Her blonde hair was pinned beneath a modest bonnet, and her gray traveling dress, though slightly wrinkled from the journey, was well made. She was slender but not fragile, with a straight posture that suggested inner strength. "Miss Collins," he managed, removing his hat. She nodded, offering a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I recognize you from your description. Tall with light brown hair, wearing a black hat." An awkward silence stretched between them. Caleb realized he should say something welcoming, but words failed him. Up close, she was prettier than her photograph suggested, with a delicate nose and full lips currently pressed together in apparent nervousness. "Let me help with your bags," he finally said, noticing 2 trunks at her feet. "Thank you." She glanced around the bustling platform. "Is it far to your ranch?" "Half a day's ride." Caleb lifted her luggage with ease. "We'll stay at the hotel tonight. The journey can wait till morning." Grace nodded, relief briefly softening her features. That would be appreciated. The train was rather taxing. They walked side by side through Laramie's main street, past saloons and general stores. Caleb noticed how Grace drew curious glances from townspeople unaccustomed to seeing him with a woman. "Word will be all over the territory by sundown," he muttered. That you've acquired a mail-order bride? Grace asked quietly. Caleb glanced at her, surprised by her directness. Yes. Does that trouble you? He considered her question. No, but it might trouble you once you see the ranch. It's not much compared to Boston. I didn't come expecting luxury, Mr. Hawkins. Caleb, he corrected. If we're to be married, you should use my given name. And I'm Grace. She met his eyes briefly before looking away. When do you propose the wedding should take place? The blunt question caught him off guard. I thought perhaps, after you've had time to settle, to be sure this is what you want. Grace's eyebrows rose slightly. That's considerate but unnecessary. I made my decision when I boarded the train. Caleb nodded, unsure whether to admire her practicality or worry about her apparent eagerness to bind herself to a stranger. The preacher comes through twice a month. He'll be here Sunday. Sunday it is then, she said with quiet finality. That night, after securing separate rooms at the hotel, Caleb lay awake contemplating the woman who would soon be his wife. She wasn't what he'd expected, neither desperate nor flighty. There was a steadiness to her, a deliberate quality that intrigued him, but also something guarded, as though she carried secrets wrapped tightly within. The next morning brought clear skies as they departed Laramie in Caleb's wagon. Grace sat primly beside him, a shawl protecting her fair skin from the sun. The journey stretched in silence until Caleb felt compelled to speak. What made you answer my advertisement? Grace considered before answering. Necessity primarily, and a desire for change. Necessity. She looked toward the distant mountains. My parents passed last year, fever, the family home went to pay debts. I'm sorry, Caleb said, genuine sympathy in his voice. Life continues, she replied with practiced stoicism. What of your family? Gone, mother when I was young, father not long after. Grace nodded as though confirming something. Then we have that in common. By midday, the wagon crested a rise revealing Whispering Pine Ranch spread across a gentle valley. The two-story house stood sturdy against the backdrop of distant mountains, with a barn, corral, and bunkhouse completing the homestead. A small creek cut through the property, bordered by the pines that gave the ranch its name. It's beautiful, Grace said softly. Caleb glanced at her, searching for falseness in her appreciation but finding none. It's isolated. Town's a half-day journey in good weather. I don't mind solitude. As they approached, Josiah emerged from the barn, followed by the ranch's other hand, Tom Weber. Both men removed their hats as the wagon pulled up. Miss Collins, Caleb said, this is Josiah Miller and Tom Weber. They work the ranch with me. Grace acknowledged them with a polite nod. Pleased to meet you both. Josiah, never one for subtlety, grinned broadly. Ma'am, you've brought some brightness to this dusty place already. A hint of color touched Grace's cheeks as Caleb helped her down from the wagon. Her hand was small but surprisingly strong in his grasp. I'll show you the house, he said, suddenly aware of how plain it would seem to Eastern eyes. Inside, Grace surveyed the practical furnishings with an inscrutable expression. The main floor held a kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a dining area, and a modest sitting room with two worn armchairs. Upstairs were two bedrooms and a small study. This would be your room, Caleb said awkwardly, gesturing to the master bedroom with its simple bed and chest of drawers. I can use the other until they were married, the unspoken words hung between them. Thank you, Grace replied, her composure never faltering. It's more spacious than I anticipated. I built most of it myself, he found himself saying. Took 3 years to get it right. Something in her expression softened. You've created something substantial here, Caleb. The sound of his name on her lips sent an unexpected warmth through him. It's been lonely work, he admitted, immediately regretting the vulnerability. Perhaps it needn't be any more, she replied quietly. The days before Sunday passed in a blur of awkward adjustments. Grace took to household duties with determined efficiency, though Caleb noted her occasional confusion with the cook stove and pump. She never complained, instead watching carefully how things were done before attempting them herself. On their third evening, Caleb returned from checking the herd to find Grace on the porch, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders, glowing gold in the sunset. For a moment he simply stared, struck by how she seemed to belong there despite her city upbringing. "Is something wrong?" she asked, noticing his hesitation. "No," he replied quickly. "Just not used to coming home to someone." She offered a small smile. "I've prepared supper, nothing elaborate, but it should be edible." The meal proved better than edible, a hearty stew with biscuits that, while slightly misshapen, tasted fine. They ate in companionable silence until Grace spoke. "Tomorrow is Sunday." Caleb set down his spoon. "Yes. Our wedding day, if that's still your intention." "It is, if it's yours." He studied her face in the lamplight. "Grace, I want you to know you have a choice. If you find this place or me not to your liking, I would understand." Her blue eyes met his directly. "I'm not one to go back on my word, Caleb. I came to be your wife, and that's what I intend. Even though we're strangers. We're less strange to each other than we were a week ago," she pointed out. "And many marriages begin with less." Caleb nodded, wondering at her pragmatism. Then tomorrow it will be. They were married in Laramie's small church with Josiah and Tom as witnesses. Grace wore her best dress, a pale blue that matched her eyes, with a small bunch of wildflowers Caleb had gathered that morning. The ceremony was brief, the preacher's words echoing in the near-empty church as they exchanged simple vows. When instructed to kiss his bride, Caleb leaned forward tentatively, his lips brushing hers in the barest suggestion of intimacy. It was their first physical contact beyond helping her in and out of the wagon, and the softness of her mouth surprised him. That night, after a modest celebration at the town's respectable hotel restaurant, they returned to separate rooms once more. Caleb had insisted, telling Grace he wanted her to have time to adjust. The truth was more complicated. He feared the awkwardness of a wedding night with a woman he barely knew, regardless of what the law now said about their relationship. The following morning brought rain as they traveled back to the ranch. Grace sat closer to him under the wagon's cover, her shoulder occasionally brushing his as the wheels hit ruts in the muddy road. "I should warn you," Caleb said as the homestead came into view, "things are likely to be different now that we're married." "How so?" "Josiah and Tom will treat you differently. As the ranch mistress." Grace contemplated this, and how should I respond? "However feels right to you. They're good men but rough around the edges." She nodded, then asked the question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "And how will things be different between us?" Caleb gripped the reins tighter. "I won't press you for wifely duties, not until you're ready." A faint blush colored her cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "I appreciate your consideration, but I'm aware of what marriage entails." Still, he insisted, there's no hurry. Life fell into an unexpected rhythm over the subsequent weeks. Grace proved adaptable, learning ranch ways with determined focus. Her cooking improved, and she took over the household accounts with an efficiency that impressed Caleb. They developed a careful dance of coexistence, sharing meals and conversation but maintaining a cautious distance. By their third week of marriage, Caleb found himself watching Grace when she wasn't looking, the graceful way she moved, the small furrow between her brows when she concentrated, the rare but transformative smile that occasionally broke through her reserved demeanor. One evening, as September winds began to hint at the coming autumn, Caleb returned from a long day of mending fences to find Grace struggling with a heavy bucket of water. "Let me," he said, taking it from her hands. "Thank you," she rubbed her palms together. "I'm afraid I'm still building the necessary strength for ranch life." "You're doing fine," he assured her, carrying the bucket inside. "Better than most would." Grace followed him into the kitchen. "Josiah mentioned there's a social gathering in town this weekend, a harvest dance." Caleb set the bucket down. "Did he suggest we attend?" "He seemed to think it would be expected, as we haven't properly celebrated our marriage with the community." The thought of dancing made Caleb uncomfortable, but he recognized the isolation Grace had endured since her arrival. "Would you like to go?" A genuine smile lit her face. "I would, yes, it would be nice to meet other women." "Then we'll go," he promised, his discomfort worth the pleasure in her eyes. Saturday evening found them dressed in their best, Caleb uncomfortable in his seldom-worn suit and Grace lovely in her blue dress. The town hall had been decorated with autumn leaves and hay bales, lanterns casting a warm glow over the gathering of ranchers, townspeople, and their families. Mrs. Hawkins, a plump woman, approached as they entered. "I'm Martha Wilson, the doctor's wife. We've been so eager to meet Caleb's bride." Grace accepted the enthusiastic greeting with composure. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Wilson. Please call me Grace." Before long, Grace was surrounded by curious women while Caleb found himself cornered by neighboring ranchers. "Mighty fine woman you got yourself," James Forrester commented, his eyes drifting to where Grace stood across the room. "Educated too, from what I hear." "She is," Caleb agreed, uncomfortable with the attention. "Lucky man," another rancher added. "Most mail-order brides aren't half so presentable." Caleb bristled at the implication. "My wife is not a commodity, Fletcher." The music started, saving Caleb from further conversation. He made his way to Grace, offering his hand with unexpected nervousness. "Would you care to dance?" Her eyes widened slightly. "I didn't know you danced." "Poorly," he admitted with a small smile, "but it seems expected." Grace placed her hand in his, and he led her to the dance floor. The fiddle player struck up a waltz, and Caleb cautiously placed his hand at her waist. Despite his warning, he moved with natural rhythm, guiding Grace through the steps with surprising ease. "You dance better than you claimed," she said, looking up at him. "My mother taught me before she passed," he admitted, "though I haven't had much practice since." Grace's hand felt small in his, her waist slender beneath his palm. For the first time, Caleb allowed himself to truly look at her, not as an arrangement or a housekeeper, but as a woman, his wife. The realization sent an unexpected heat through him. "Everyone is watching us," Grace murmured. "Let them," he replied, drawing her slightly closer. "They've nothing better to do." A smile touched her lips. "Mrs. Wilson informed me that half the unmarried men in the territory had their eyes on your advertisement. She seemed quite impressed I was the one who secured the position." "Position?" Caleb raised an eyebrow. "Is that how you see our marriage?" The directness of his question caught her off guard. No. Not entirely." "How do you see it, then?" Grace hesitated, "An opportunity for both of us." "Is that all?" The music drew to a close before she could answer. As they separated, Caleb noticed a man watching them from the edge of the room, well-dressed, city clothes, with a calculating expression that raised Caleb's instincts. "Do you know that man?" he asked Grace. She followed his gaze, and Caleb felt her stiffen beside him. "No," she said quickly, "I don't." But something in her voice struck false, and when he looked back, the stranger was gone. The ride home was quiet, Grace seemingly lost in thought. Under the silver moonlight, Caleb studied her profile, noting the tension in her jaw. "Did you enjoy the evening?" he finally asked. "Yes," she replied, though her enthusiasm seemed diminished. "The women were welcoming." "And the men respectful, I hope." A small smile touched her lips. "Quite, your reputation seems to have protected me from any unwanted attention." "My reputation?" "As someone not to be trifled with," she clarified. "Mrs. Wilson mentioned you once threw a man through the saloon window for insulting a woman." Caleb frowned. "That was years ago, and he deserved worse." "I believe you," Grace said softly. "You're a good man, Caleb Hawkins." The simple declaration warmed him more than it should have. "I try to be." That night after they returned home, Caleb walked Grace to her bedroom door as had become their custom. Usually, he would bid her good night and retire to his room across the hall, but tonight something kept him lingering. "Grace," he said, his voice lower than intended, "I've been meaning to ask." Yes, her blue eyes searched his face. The question that had been building for weeks finally emerged. "Are you happy here?" "With this arrangement?" Grace considered his words carefully. "I'm content. The ranch is beautiful, the work satisfying in its way." "That's not what I asked." She looked down briefly before meeting his gaze again. "Happiness is a luxury I haven't allowed myself to consider, Caleb. Survival has been my focus for some time." The honesty of her answer touched something in him. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers lightly touching her cheek. "Perhaps we both deserve more than mere survival." Grace's breath caught, her lips parting slightly. For a moment, Caleb thought he might kiss her, properly this time, not the chaste brush of lips from their wedding. But uncertainty held him back. "Good night, Grace," he said softly, dropping his hand. "Good night, Caleb." As October turned the surrounding hills gold and crimson, the careful distance between them began to diminish. They worked side by side in the vegetable garden, preparing it for winter. Their conversations grew longer, more personal. Caleb found himself sharing stories of his youth, of his dreams for the ranch. Grace spoke of her childhood in Boston, though Caleb noticed she rarely mentioned the year before she came west. One crisp afternoon, Caleb returned from town with the mail to find Grace in the barn, attempting to milk their cow with limited success. "Having trouble?" he asked, leaning against the stall door. Grace looked up, a streak of dirt across one cheek and frustration evident in her expression. "She doesn't seem to like me." "Bessie's particular about who handles her," Caleb explained, setting down the mail. "Here, let me show you." He knelt beside Grace, his hands covering hers to demonstrate the proper technique. The closeness sent his heart racing unexpectedly, her scent, soap, and something uniquely her, filling his senses. "Like this," he murmured, guiding her fingers in the rhythmic motion, gentle but firm. Milk finally streamed into the bucket, and Grace laughed with delight. The sound, so rare from her usually composed demeanor, captivated Caleb. When she turned her head to smile at him, their faces were inches apart. For a suspended moment, neither moved. Then, with a courage he hadn't known he possessed, Caleb closed the distance between them. This kiss was nothing like their wedding day. It was warm, real, his lips moving against hers with growing hunger. To his surprise and relief, Grace responded, her hand coming up to rest against his chest. The milking forgotten, they lost themselves in the discovery of each other until a noise from outside broke the spell. Caleb pulled back reluctantly, his breathing uneven. "I've wanted to do that for weeks." A blush colored Grace's cheeks. "Why didn't you?" "I didn't want to press you, didn't want you to feel." He searched for the right word, obligated. Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Because of our arrangement." "Yes." Grace studied him for a long moment. "What changed?" "Everything," he admitted. "The way I see you, the way I see us." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Caleb helped Grace to her feet just as Josiah called from outside. "Caleb, you better come quick." Concern instantly replaced the warmth in Caleb's expression. He squeezed Grace's hand briefly before striding out of the barn. 3 riders were approaching the house, the sheriff from Laramie flanked by 2 deputies. "Sheriff Davis," Caleb greeted, tension evident in his stance. "What brings you out this way?" The sheriff dismounted, his expression grim. "Got some questions, Hawkins, about your wife." Caleb felt Grace emerge from the barn behind him. "What about my wife?" "There's a man in town looking for her. Says she's wanted back east." Caleb turned to Grace, whose face had gone pale. "What's he talking about?" Before she could answer, the sheriff continued. "Man claims she's Grace Covington, not Collins. Says she embezzled funds from a Boston bank before fleeing west." The accusation hung in the air like gunsmoke. Caleb looked at Grace, searching her face for denial, for explanation. What he saw instead was fear and guilt. "Grace," he asked quietly. "It's not what it seems," she whispered. Sheriff Davis stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me to town to sort this out." Caleb moved protectively in front of her. "She's not going anywhere until I understand what's happening." "Caleb," Grace's voice trembled slightly. "Please let me explain." The sheriff frowned. "Hawkins, don't make this difficult. Either she comes willingly to answer questions, or I take her in custody." "Give us a minute," Caleb demanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. The sheriff hesitated, then nodded. 5 minutes. "Inside where I can see you through the window." Caleb guided Grace into the house, his mind reeling. Once inside, he turned to her, struggling to keep his voice level. "Tell me the truth." "All of it." Grace sank into a chair, her composed facade crumbling. "My name is Grace Covington, though I legally changed it to Collins after everything happened." "And the embezzlement." She looked up, anguish clear in her eyes. "I worked as a clerk at the First Bank of Boston. My father was the manager before he fell ill. When he died, I discovered he had been falsifying records to cover shortages. Your father was a thief? Caleb asked incredulously. No, Grace shook her head vehemently. He was covering for someone else, Arthur Blackwell, the bank owner's son. I found evidence that Arthur had been stealing for years, but when I confronted him. What happened? He threatened to ruin my family's name, to claim my father had been the thief all along. Her voice hardened. Then he offered an alternative marriage to him, in exchange for silence. Understanding began to dawn on Caleb. You refused. I did worse, Grace admitted. I gathered proof of his crimes and took it to his father. But Arthur had already poisoned him against me, claiming I had developed an inappropriate attachment and was making false accusations when rejected. And they accused you of the theft instead, Caleb concluded. Grace nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I had no choice but to flee. I took nothing but what was rightfully mine, my mother's jewelry and my savings, but they're calling it theft. The man at the dance, Caleb suddenly realized. He was looking for you. One of Arthur's associates, she confirmed. They want to make an example of me, a woman who dared to challenge powerful men. Caleb paced the small room, processing her story. Why didn't you tell me any of this? Would you have accepted me as your bride if you knew I was running from the law? Her question held no accusation, only sad reality. You're not a thief, he stated firmly. No, she agreed. But I am a fugitive. Outside, the sheriff cleared his throat loudly. Their time was up. Caleb knelt before Grace, taking her hands in his. Listen to me, I believe you, and I won't let them take you. Hope flickered briefly in her eyes. There's nothing you can do, Caleb. I've been running for over a year. I'm tired. Do you trust me? He asked intently. After a heartbeat of hesitation, she nodded. Yes. Then follow my lead. They emerged from the house together, Caleb's arm protectively around Grace's shoulders. Sheriff, he said calmly, my wife has nothing to hide. She'll answer your questions, but here, not in town. Sheriff Davis frowned. The gentleman making the accusations is waiting in Laramie. Then he can ride out here, Caleb stated firmly. My wife is in a delicate condition and shouldn't be subjected to a long journey. Grace stiffened beside him but maintained her composure as the sheriff's expression shifted to embarrassment. I wasn't aware, Davis removed his hat awkwardly. Congratulations are in order, I suppose. Thank you, Caleb replied smoothly. We only recently confirmed it ourselves. The sheriff looked between them, clearly reconsidering his approach. Well, I suppose there's no harm in conducting the interview here. I'll send for Mr. Blackwell. We appreciate your understanding, Grace said quietly. After the sheriff and his deputies departed, Grace turned to Caleb with wide eyes. A delicate condition, she whispered. It bought us time, he explained, and made him less eager to drag you to jail. And when they discover I'm not with child. Caleb's expression turned grim. By then we'll have a plan. That evening, Caleb sent Josiah to town with a telegram for an old army friend who had become a lawyer in Denver. Meanwhile, he and Grace combed through the documents she had kept hidden in a false bottom of her trunk, bank ledgers, correspondence, and notes in Arthur Blackwell's hand directing her father to alter accounts. This is damning evidence, Caleb observed, studying the papers spread across the table. Why didn't you take it to the authorities? The local magistrate was Arthur's godfather, Grace explained bitterly, and Arthur's father owned half the city council. Who would believe a woman over them? Caleb looked up at her, seeing for the first time the full weight she had been carrying. You've been fighting this battle alone. I had no choice, she said simply. You do now, he replied, reaching for her hand. You have me. The simple declaration broke something in her, and Grace's careful composure finally crumbled completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks as months of fear and loneliness poured out. Without hesitation, Caleb pulled her into his arms, holding her as she sobbed against his chest. I'm sorry, she whispered against his shirt. I never meant to bring this to your door. Our door, he corrected gently, his hand stroking her hair, and I'm not sorry you did. Grace looked up at him, her tear-stained face vulnerable in a way he had never seen. Why? Because it brought you to me, he said simply, the truth of it resonating through him. The woman who had arrived as his mail-order bride had become precious to him in ways he had never anticipated. The thought of losing her to false accusations was unbearable. That night, for the first time, they shared a bed not in passion but in comfort and solidarity. Caleb held Grace against him, her head tucked beneath his chin, as they discussed strategies for the coming confrontation. 2 days later, Arthur Blackwell arrived at Whispering Pine Ranch accompanied by Sheriff Davis. Blackwell was everything Caleb despised in Eastern gentlemen, soft-handed, supercilious, with eyes that evaluated everything in terms of monetary worth. "Mrs. Hawkins," Blackwell greeted with false cordiality when Grace appeared on the porch. "Or should I say Miss Covington?" "It's Mrs. Hawkins," Caleb corrected firmly, standing beside his wife. "State your business and be done with it." Blackwell smiled thinly. "My business is with this woman who stole $12,000 from my father's bank before fleeing Boston. I've come to return her to face justice." "That's a lie," Grace replied, her voice steady despite her pallor. "And you know it." Sheriff Davis looked uncomfortable. "Perhaps we should discuss this inside." "There's nothing to discuss," Caleb stated. "My wife is innocent of these charges." "That will be for a court to decide," Blackwell replied smoothly. "I have the necessary papers for her extradition." "What you have," came a new voice from the road, "is a serious legal problem, Mr. Blackwell." All turned to see a distinguished man in a city suit dismounting from a horse. Josiah rode beside him looking pleased with himself. "And you are?" Blackwell demanded. "Samuel Ross, attorney at law." The newcomer approached, extending a document to the sheriff. "I represent Mrs. Hawkins, and I have here a counter-complaint against Mr. Arthur Blackwell for embezzlement, false accusation, and attempted character assassination." Sheriff Davis took the papers with evident confusion. "What's all this?" "Evidence," Ross explained, "that Mr. Blackwell systematically stole from the First Bank of Boston over a period of years, using the late Mr. Covington to falsify records. When Mrs. Hawkins, then Miss Covington, discovered the fraud, Mr. Blackwell attempted to silence her through threats and false accusations." Blackwell's face flushed with anger. "This is preposterous. She has no proof." "On the contrary," Grace said quietly, stepping forward with a bundle of documents. "I have ledgers in your handwriting directing my father to alter accounts. I have notes of withdrawal amounts and dates. I even have a letter where you threatened to make me sorry if I didn't accept your proposal." The sheriff looked between the parties, clearly out of his depth. "This seems beyond my jurisdiction." "Indeed it is," Ross agreed smoothly. "Which is why I've also brought a federal marshal. He's currently in Laramie, awaiting my signal to investigate interstate fraud." The blood drained from Blackwell's face. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Ross smiled coldly. The telegraph office in Denver was quite interested in the evidence Mrs. Hawkins preserved, as was the Boston Herald newspaper. Caleb watched the calculation in Blackwell's eyes, the desperate search for escape. "Your choice is simple," Caleb said quietly. "Withdraw your accusations against my wife and return to Boston in disgrace or face federal charges for bank fraud." "You can't do this to me," Blackwell hissed, his refined facade crumbling. "Do you know who my father is?" "A man about to be very disappointed in his son, I imagine," Ross replied. "Sheriff, do you need anything further from Mrs. Hawkins?" Davis shook his head, handing the legal papers back. "Not if she has this kind of evidence. This is way above my responsibilities." "Then I suggest Mr. Blackwell leave this property immediately," Caleb stated, his hand coming to rest protectively at Grace's back. Blackwell's eyes narrowed with hatred. "This isn't over." "Yes," Grace said with quiet dignity, "it is." As Blackwell and the sheriff departed, Caleb felt Grace trembling beside him despite her brave front. Only when the riders disappeared from view did she allow her composure to falter, turning into Caleb's embrace. "Is it really over?" she whispered. "It is," Ross confirmed, approaching them. "Once I file these documents formally, Mr. Blackwell will be far too concerned with saving himself to bother you further." Caleb extended his hand to the lawyer. "Thank you, Sam, I owe you." Ross shook it firmly. "Consider us even for that time in Colorado." He turned to Grace with a respectful nod. Mrs. Hawkins, you've shown remarkable courage preserving this evidence. Few would have had the foresight. Or the desperation, she added with a faint smile. After Ross departed for town, promising to return the next day with final paperwork, Caleb and Grace were left alone on the porch. The autumn sun was setting, painting the distant mountains gold and purple. "You're free," Caleb said softly. Grace looked up at him, her blue eyes clear for the first time since he'd known her. "Yes." "What will you do now?" A small furrow appeared between her brows. "What do you mean?" "Our marriage," Caleb explained carefully, "was arranged when you needed escape and protection. Now that the threat is gone, you may want different choices." Understanding dawned in her expression. "You think I want to leave?" "I wouldn't blame you if you did," he said honestly. "You never chose this life freely." Grace stepped closer, her hand coming up to touch his cheek with a tenderness that made his heart ache. "Caleb Hawkins, when I came here I was looking for safety, nothing more. I never expected to find a man of such integrity and kindness." "Grace, let me finish," she insisted gently. "These past months have shown me something I never thought to find again, hope. Hope for happiness, for a future worth living, not just surviving." She took a deep breath. "If you'll still have me, not as your mail order bride but as your wife in truth, I would choose to stay." The doubt that had plagued Caleb since her arrival, that she was with him only from necessity, finally dissolved. He pulled her close, his arms encircling her waist. "I never thought I'd find someone who could understand this life, who could share it with me," he confessed. "The frontier isn't kind to love. But with you, I want to try." "Then try," she whispered, rising on her toes to meet his lips. The kiss deepened, no longer restrained by uncertainty or secrets. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Grace Hawkins," he said, the words he'd never expected to speak flowing naturally now. "Not because I needed a wife, but because you are the woman I would choose every day for the rest of my life." Tears glistened in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "And I love you, Caleb Hawkins. Not because you saved me, but because you saw me, truly saw me, when no one else did." That night, as the first snow of winter dusted Whispering Pine Ranch, Caleb and Grace truly became husband and wife. Their union, begun as a practical arrangement between strangers, transformed into something neither had dared hope for, a love strong enough to weather the harsh realities of frontier life. As spring returned to Wyoming Territory, the ranch flourished under their joint care. Grace's Eastern education proved invaluable for expanding their operations, while Caleb's strength and knowledge of the land provided the foundation. Together they built something neither could have achieved alone. Visitors to Whispering Pine Ranch often remarked on the unusual story of how the Hawkins had come together, she arriving as a mail-order bride, he discovering not just a wife but a true partner and the love of his life. What few knew was the full truth, that in seeking merely a practical arrangement, Caleb Hawkins had discovered a treasure beyond price in the brave, intelligent woman who now shared his name, his bed, and his heart. And Grace, who had fled west with nothing but secrets and fear, found in her cowboy husband the home and belonging she had never dared dream possible. The frontier that once seemed so vast and lonely became, in their love for each other, the perfect place to build a life worth living.